Come on in, bestie. Welcome to StoryPod, where we do the doing of story development together. Brought to you by Creative BFF. Hello, friend. Welcome. Welcome to the StoryPod podcast. I giggled because I thought of one of my best friends who hates it when people say, hello, my friend. Hello, friend. And it just made me laugh. This one's for you, girl. Sorry. My name is Ashley. Thank you for joining me. Before I get started, if you have any story questions that you would like me to answer here on the podcast, please feel free to email me at ash@creativebff.com, or you can go to my website and drop a comment or a comment in the contact section. Please make sure that in the subject you put story question, because listen, as you know, I'm sure we get all kinds of spam in the emails, and if I don't see that it's a story question, girl, I would be deleting it and shining it on, okay? But in the meantime, until you do so, until you have a story that you're working on and you need some help, which also, side note, I can do that. I am a story coach. We can just work one-on-one. It doesn't have to be on the podcast, girl. Girl is a general universal term that I use for male and female. So, all of my male girls out here, feel free to hit me up if you need help with your story. But in the meantime, today, what we're doing is we are answering another question from Reddit. And it's more so, it's not really a story question per se, like where we're helping to develop somebody's story. It's more so like a general, well, let me stop describing it and just read the question to you. Let's avert our eyes. You don't have to avert your eyes, but I will be averting my eyes. So from Null Psyche on the r/fantasy writers subreddit, they ask, does the setting have to specifically mean something? To boil everything down to a simple point, is it still worth writing a story as fantasy if it could be written as a non-fantasy story? The story on my mind is a story about addiction and emotional awareness, and I've always had it set in a fantasy setting using a harmful, addictive type of magic rather than drugs, or addictive behaviors like SH/ED behaviors. I'm not sure what SH is, but I think ED is eating disorder. But I guess part of me is feeling like it's not worth writing as fantasy if it doesn't specifically need the fantasy setting. The only way I can think of that the fantasy setting specifically helps the story is because the idea of using a harmful kind of magic makes the themes more broadly applicable to both substance abuse and addictive behaviors instead of being specifically one or the other. That's just how I feel like doing it enough of a reason to set a story in a fantasy world rather than the real world? I'm gonna cut to the chase. This might be another short episode, girl. I think that's just how I feel like doing it. In this case, absolutely is a relevant reason, a good reason for you to set your story in a fantasy world, even though you could technically put it in our regular world. Okay, yeah, you could base it in our world and deal with real things, but girl, sorry for that mini earthquake. Deal with real stuff like real drugs, these, the issues that you mentioned, SH//ED. Yes, you could, but so many of us, are faced with these things in real life, and sometimes we want to escape from the real world. So being able to slip into a fantasy world is always fun. I think that putting it in a fantasy world also, as you already mentioned, gives you the ability to pull in some fun things like magic and things like that. Different magics, different types of creatures, different, additional themes. You can go further, I think, if you set it in a fantasy world than if you set it in our real world. And I feel like it'll be just on a purely personal level. If you love fantasy, it'll be more interesting and more enjoyable for you to write, and that'll come across in the writing. You will enjoy the exercise of writing more if you set it in a world that you're interested in and that you enjoy. And I assume if you're writing fantasy, you like to read fantasy. So I think that forcing yourself, tying yourself, binding yourself to just because these are concepts that could be handled in a more real world setting that you should, I think is not the way to think about it. Okay? Don't do that. Write it where you want to write it. You could put those themes in a horror. You could put those themes in a sci-fi, which certainly we've seen that. I mean, one fantasy that I can think of that has elements of addiction in it, but it's firmly set in a fantasy world is Dragon Age. I think it was the third Dragon Age where they had a character. I mean, the theme of this is throughout the Dragon Age series. I haven't played the most recent one, but the Templars, in order to have access to certain abilities and, like to, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the ability to like nullify magic, because the Templars were, I believe, tell me if I'm not remembering this correctly, but they were specifically like a, what is the term I'm trying to think of? Basically like a police force for mages and witches and things like that. And so they had to have certain abilities that would allow them to have stand a chance against them, right? So in order to get those abilities, they had to use a certain substance, which eventually became addictive to them and would have similar effects of going through withdrawal once they stopped taking it. And there may have been some other more serious physical ramifications of that as well, like deteriorations. I don't know if I can't remember if it caused death and things like that. And there was a character named Cullen who was a Templar, and you get more into his story. I think he appeared in maybe the first and the second before he was a more featured character in the third, or maybe he just showed up in the second. I can't remember where he made his appearance first, but he was a Templar, and he was going through withdrawals, getting off of that particular substance whose name I cannot remember. And so there was that theme, but it was firmly in a fantasy setting. And I think that there is a certain, again, I can't think of the word. Girl, come on, word brain, where is it? It's only when I'm writing that I can think of all these words that I want to say. But there's a certain additional interest and intrigue, I think, that you can cause your reader to feel when you bring in these subjects that might be familiar, but you put them in a world that's kind of unfamiliar. Not necessarily. We're pretty familiar with fantasy worlds, but when you put it in a new and fresh setting, and it's interesting to see. I think it would be interesting to see how the society and how characters in this fantasy world deal with these types of subjects. How are they viewed in society? Are there like programs and things like that help these kind of people? It's interesting to see the differences and the similarities of how these particular subjects are handled in your fantasy world. And I think that is it adds something fresh and new to it. And I think that you are getting an audience who may not read like a hard-hitting, gritty story set in our real world about addiction and its effects, by putting it in a fantasy world. And you have an opportunity to reach an audience that you wouldn't reach necessarily if you were setting it in the real world. Because I wouldn't read it, no shade to that, but it's just not my cup of tea. I don't necessarily want to read. This is me. Now, this is pure opinion, and me sharing this opinion does not mean that I think that you are wrong or whatever for enjoying this kind of real world story. And hopefully you don't think that I'm wrong or stupid or vapid for not necessarily enjoying a real world, hard hitting, gritty story about addiction and substance abuse and things like that, because girl, we see it every day walking down the street. When I'm reading a book, I want to read something that helps me to escape. So I wouldn't necessarily read a book set in the real world about an addict or something like that, unless there's a very interesting hook, because I feel like, me personally, I don't want to necessarily expose myself to trauma that feels real and close to home and things like that. But if it's in a fantasy setting and you have additional themes that you can explore that are interesting, and then the addiction aspect of it is kind of like an interesting spice that you add to this fantasy world, it holds my attention more than if it was set in the real world. So those are my thoughts. I am not going to belabor because I feel like I don't have anything else to say other than put it in the world that you want it to be in, so that you can enjoy the process of writing, and so that you can reach people who you wouldn't necessarily reach by setting it in the real world. Because I mean, the way that you even phrase the question, null psyche, of like, well, should I? It's like you were just like, oh, gritting my teeth, like, do I have to put it in a real world? Because it doesn't necessarily have to be. Nothing, honestly, if we're being real, nothing really has to be set in a fantasy world. I think, without me thinking deeply about this, I think that so many stories and themes that are set in fantasy realms can be set in a real world type of thing, right? These story archetypes. Okay, maybe they won't have access to magic. So unless magic is an extremely crucial, central element of your fantasy story, you can probably set any story that would have been set in a fantasy realm in the real world. But is it going to be as interesting? And maybe I'm totally wrong. I could be wrong. I might just be talking out the side of my neck when I just said that. And if you think that I am, please let me know down below in the comments, and perhaps we will have a discussion about it. Tell me why I'm wrong. Or if you agree, like, cool, let's shake hands on it and let's talk about how right we are together. You know what I'm saying? But in any case, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the podcast. Another relatively brief one. These ones where I'm just answering kind of like general questions with my opinion. Again, all of this is my own opinion. I tend to be a little more brief because that talking starts happening when that story starts coming through, girl. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, listen, love you. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for joining me. Okay, you're adorable. And I'll see you next time, girl.